Welcome to History Date Night, a World War II podcast covering the Second World War in chronological order, from the opening shots to final victory. I'm Justin, and joining me is my wife and co-host, Jenny. Together we explore the people, battles, and turning points that shape the deadliest conflict in human history, one date at a time. On this episode,
some families burn their own homes to the ground.
I will not permit a single shell to be fired.
Finland was never the point. Welcome back to History Date Night. I'm Jenny. Last episode, the Winter War ended. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed at midnight, and President Kahlo cursed his own hand that signed the peace treaty. This episode, March 13th through 18th, we deal with what comes after that. The evacuation of roughly 450,000 people from the land Finland just gave away. The collapse of the Allied plan to use Finland as an excuse to occupy Norway. The first British civilian killed by a German bomb, and a meeting at a railway station on the Austrian border that sets Italy irreversibly on the road to war.
I'm Justin. This week also has an Indian nationalist assassinating a British colonial governor 21 years after a massacre in Amritsar, a Nobel laureate dying in Sweden, a baseball all-star game played to raise money for Finnish relief, and Sumner Welles finishing his tour of Europe having accomplished, by his own honest assessment, essentially nothing. Let's get into it. So we told the story of the peace signing last episode. What we didn't dwell on is what these final hours actually looked like on the ground. As dawn broke on March 13th, word had reached most Finnish units that the war would end at 11 a.m. Some accounts describe both sides taking the last hours easy, a kind of exhausted mutual understanding settling over the front. But that didn't last. As the final half hour approached, Soviet artillery opened up with a tremendous barrage against Finnish positions. Not scattered fire, but a deliberate heavy bombardment that continued until the literal last minute of the war.
Individual commanders reacted to the end in their own ways. Major Lasse Varko, whose detachment had been fighting on the western shore of the Bay of Viipuri, sent a message to his troops that read, in essence, by 11 a.m., kill as many Russians as possible without taking any losses of our own. Lieutenant General Harold Oquist, commander of the Finnish II Corps, issued a daily order after the ceasefire that included the line, "One can never in any situation trust our arch-enemy." The peace had just been signed. Nobody on the Finnish side believed that it was the last word.
One Soviet officer's account of the final hours, recorded years later, captures the confusion in the ranks. Colonel Viktor Iskrov describes a phone call from his battery commander asking if he was still planning to fight. Iskrov, unaware that the war was ending, was elated. He could see Viipuri burning and the Mannerheim line had been broken, and he wanted to press on toward the city of Vasa. His commander told him that the war was over. They'd just signed an armistice yesterday, and said, "I will not permit a single shell to be fired." Iskrov's own battalion commander did not know the war had ended either. The confusion in the ranks about whether the fighting was really finished lasted through the final hours on both sides.
The morning of March 13th also brought a piece of good news buried in the larger catastrophe. Simo Heha, the sniper we discussed in past episodes, hit in the jaw on March 6th and thought possibly lost, regains consciousness. He wakes to find the war he fought in for 98 days is over. He will require extensive facial reconstruction, but he will live for another 62 years.
Now for the full reckoning. Finland mobilized roughly 300,000 men over the course of the war, but never had much more than 200,000 at the front at any one time. They lost about 25,000 dead, with around 45,000 wounded. Against them, the Soviet Union committed as many as 1.2 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft. Official Soviet figures put their own losses at around 48,000 dead and 158,000 wounded, but these numbers are now understood to be significant undercounts. Historians generally estimate that 125,000 to 170,000 Soviet deaths, with total casualties much, much higher, and some analysis suggesting even more. One Soviet general is reported to have said, on hearing that the Soviet Union would receive all of the Karelian Isthmus in the treaty, "We have won just about enough ground to bury our dead."
The disparity in losses was not lost on observers at the time. It confirmed for military analysts on every side, Allied and German alike, that Stalin's purges of his own officer corps in the late 1930s had gutted Soviet military competence in ways that would take years to repair. And it did not end well for many of the Soviet soldiers who survived Finnish captivity. Many returning prisoners were taken to NKVD camps, interrogated on suspicion of having been compromised, imprisoned, and in some cases executed. Surviving capture was, for a Red Army soldier under Stalin, its own ordeal.
Finland then was a country of under 4 million people. 25,000 dead in 105 days is over 0.5% of the entire population that's killed outright. And when you add in the wounded, Finland lost more than a couple of percent of its population in just over 3 months. Applied to the United States today, that would be millions of casualties in a single winter. Finland did this while fielding an army smaller than many American state national guards, against one of the largest militaries on Earth.
March 14th. The evacuation of Finnish Karelia begins in earnest. Over 450,000 Finns start crossing into what remains of Finland from the territory just ceded to the Soviet Union. This is roughly 1/8 of Finland's entire population, uprooted in a matter of days. Some families burn their own homes to the ground before leaving, rather than hand over anything usable to the Soviet administration that will replace them. Livestock is driven ahead of them on foot. Furniture, tools, and family possessions that cannot be carried are simply just left or destroyed.
President Kallo gives a radio address to the nation this week that goes beyond the immediate crisis. He says, quote, "I dare to hope that the necessity of a Scandinavian defensive alliance has become clear during this war, also to our neighbors." End quote. It's a pointed remark, a suggestion that Sweden and Norway's refusal to help Finland might finally convince them that a unified Nordic defense pact is necessary. That alliance never materializes in the form that Kallo hopes for. Sweden and Norway will each face their own reckonings with the war within the year, separately and largely alone.
On March 15th, the Finnish parliament, meeting in secret session, ratifies the Moscow Peace Treaty by a vote of 145 to 3, with 45 members absent and 9 abstaining. Prime Minister Ryti tells the assembled people, Finland, as well as the whole of Western civilization, is still in the greatest danger, and no one can say what tomorrow may bring. We believe that by choosing peace, we have acted in the best way for the moment. It is not a triumphant speech, but it's the speech of a man who knows that this is an interim peace, not a final one. And the Finnish public already has a name for it. Valoruha, the interim peace. Almost everyone in Finland expects the Soviet Union to come back and finish the job.
Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner addresses the nation directly on the radio and says a line that has stayed in Finnish memory ever since. Quote, "In the last reckoning, our only fault was that we were too small a people." End quote. And basically, it's a devastating verdict on the entire episode. It's not a statement of Finnish failure, but of Finnish smallness against forces that made resistance alone, however brilliant, ultimately insufficient. The bitterness towards Sweden in particular is widespread and long-lasting in Finland. Sweden had sent volunteers and supplies, but Sweden had not sent its army and had refused passage to anyone else's. The immediate practical crisis is what to do with 450,000 displaced people in a country that has just lost a war and ceded a large chunk of its productive farmland. Finland spends the following months building resettlement programs, land redistribution schemes, and temporary housing on a national scale. And it becomes one of the more remarkable and least internationally recognized humanitarian and administrative achievements of the early war. A small country absorbing an internal refugee population equal to more than 1 in 10 of its own citizens, without the kind of chaos and famine that such displacement has produced elsewhere.
Circling back to the Allied plan for Norway, because this week is when it falls apart, at least for now. We discussed that the plan to send troops to Finland by way of Norway and Sweden was never really about Finland. It was about seizing the Norwegian port of Narvik and the Swedish iron ore fields of Gallivare before Germany could secure them. On March 11th, the British War Cabinet formally decides to launch this operation, codenamed Wilfred. Landings planned for Narvik, followed by Stavanger, Bergen, and Trondheim. The plan is formalized on March 12th. Notably, The British decide that they will not tell the Norwegian government anything about it until their ships have actually arrived at Narvik. This is, in the words of one historian, a most dishonest business. Britain is planning to violate the sovereignty of a neutral country in order to advance their own war aims.
Then, on March 13th, news of the Soviet-Finnish peace treaty reaches London. Wilfrid's entire justification evaporates. There is no more Finland to rescue, no excuse to invoke. On March 14th, the operation is formally abandoned. Churchill, who had been one of Wilfrid's biggest advocates, protests. Lord Halifax, though, the Foreign Secretary, argues that going ahead with an unprovoked landing in Norway now, with no Finnish crisis to justify it, would only succeed in convincing Norway and Sweden to align themselves with Germany out of self-preservation. Halifax wins the argument, and Wilfrid is shelved.
Nobody in the British planning process seems to have seriously thought about what would have happened if the operation had gone ahead and actually succeeded in reaching Finland. If British and French troops had physically arrived in Finland, they would have found themselves in an active shooting war against Stalin's military, a war that neither government had actually committed to fighting. British planners note on the 13th that of the 4 or 5 divisions that might have been sent, not a single one was actually intended for Finland. Perhaps a brigade, or roughly 1% of the total troops, were destined for Finland itself, and that's just if the Finns were lucky. The rest were always meant for occupying the iron ore mines. Finland was never the point. Finland was the door that Britain wanted to walk through to get to Sweden's mines.
Germany's plans for Norway do not share this hesitation. According to General Alfred Jodel's diary entry for March 14th, Hitler is actively searching for a pretext to justify the invasion he has already decided to launch. He doesn't need one, strictly speaking. He's already committed to Operation Weserübung, regardless of what excuse presents itself. But having a plausible public justification matters to him. German naval planners had briefly wondered whether the pressure to secure Scandinavian iron might ease now that the Allies no longer have their Finnish excuse to invade Norway themselves. Hitler and Admiral Raeder decide the invasion proceeds anyway. The ore is necessary, the naval bases would be useful, and the planning is too far advanced to abandon.
March 16th, Scapa Flow, the Orkney Islands. 15 German Junkers 88 dive bombers attack the Royal Navy's home fleet anchorage. The same anchorage U-47 penetrated back in October. One bomb strikes the cruiser HMS Norfolk below the waterline, killing 6 sailors and wounding 7, though the ship survives with what the Admiralty calls minor damage. None of the attacking German aircraft are shot down, though several RAF pilots claim damage inflicted in the ensuing fights.
But the detail that makes this raid historically significant happened on land, not at sea. One bomb, apparently released by a German aircraft, which was turning away from the main target, lands wide of the naval base entirely. It lands in the small village of Bridge of Wythe, on the shore of Loch Stennis. James Isbister, who was 27 years old, was standing in the doorway of his home. He had, according to witnesses, been about to run across the road to help a neighbor whose cottage had just been hit. But he is killed instantly. He leaves behind a widow and an infant son. He is the first British civilian killed by a German bomb on British soil in the entire war.
Churchill raises the incident with the War Cabinet in terms that reveal a real domestic political pressure building beneath the surface of the Phoney War. He tells his colleagues there is, in his words, considerable feeling in the country that while the Germans use bombs, Britain only drops leaflets. It's a fair criticism. Just the day before his raid, Britain bombers had dropped over 6 million propaganda leaflets over Germany. Meanwhile, German bombs are now killing British civilians in their own villages. A reprisal raid is discussed, and plans begin to form right here.
On March 17th, Dr. Fritz Todt, an engineer with no military background, who was previously known for building Germany's autobahns, is appointed Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions. Todt's appointment marks the beginning of a systemic, ruthlessly efficient reorganization of German war production, one that will increasingly depend on forced and slave labor drawn from occupied populations across Europe. The organization that bears his name will eventually become the largest single employer in the Reich. Todt himself will not live to see most of what his ministry builds. He would die in a plane crash in 1942. But the machinery that he sets in motion this week will run for the rest of the war. Now moving into this next section, I need to apologize. Last episode, I mistakenly said that Welles returned to Washington after a stop in Britain, but that was a mistake. Our sources actually say that Sumner Welles continued his European tour this week as he returned to Italy. On March 16th, back in Rome, Welles meets again with Mussolini, Count Ciano, and King Victor Emmanuel III. Welles notes that Mussolini seems to be in noticeably better spirits than their first meeting 3 weeks earlier, more animated, more like the public figure the newsreels project. Whatever was weighing on him in late February seems to have lifted, or at least been set aside.
On March 18th, Welles and Myron Taylor, the American representative to the Vatican, meet with Pope Pius XII. Taylor asks the Pope a pointed question. If Mussolini brings Italy into the war, is there a serious risk of revolution or civil unrest? Well, the Pope was surprised by the question. After careful consideration, he answers that Italian public opinion is overwhelmingly opposed to entering the war, but that he does not believe there would be any organized rebellion, at least not for some time, if Mussolini just went ahead anyway. It's a realistic and slightly grim assessment. The Italian public doesn't want this war, and the Italian public will very likely just have to go along with it regardless.
That same day, March 18th, at the Brenner Pass, which is a mountain crossing on the Austrian-Italian border roughly 60 miles north of Bolzano in the Alps, Hitler and Mussolini meet in person. Mussolini arrives first on an armored train. Half an hour later, Hitler's train pulls in to a fanfare of trumpets. 2 German national anthems play, the Deutschlandlied and the Horst Wessel song, a song written by German paramilitary member named Horst Wessel. The 2 dictators exchange fascist salutes and walk the length of the platform together to Mussolini's private railway car, where they talk behind drawn blinds at a small table, joined later by Ciano and Ribbentrop.
Within 2 hours, Hitler has what he came for, a promise that Italy will eventually enter the war. Mussolini tries to suggest that Germany's coming Western offensive might be delayed a few months to give Italy more time to prepare. Hitler's answer is blunt. Germany will not alter its own plans to accommodate Italy's readiness. The two agree that Italy will join in due course, on its own timeline, whenever Mussolini judges the moment right. Ciano, present at the meeting, remains privately and strongly opposed to Italian intervention. He will be proven right to worry, though not soon enough to change what's coming.
So a few grace notes from the week to mention before we close. On March 13th in London, an Indian nationalist named Udham Singh assassinates Sir Michael O'Dyer at Caxton Hall in Westminster. O'Dyer had been the lieutenant governor of Punjab in 1919, at the time of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, when British troops under General Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd of Indian civilians gathered for the Baisakhi festival that also included a political protest which ended up killing hundreds. Singh, who was present at the massacre as a young man and was himself wounded, had spent 21 years planning his revenge. He is arrested at the scene and will be executed in 1940. The Empire's violence in India in 1919 would return to bite the British at a lecture hall in London in 1940, in the middle of a completely different, unrelated war.
On March 16th, Selma Lagerlöf, the Swedish novelist and the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, dies at 81. And on March 17th, in Tampa, Florida, Major League Baseball holds a special spring training all-star exhibition to raise money for the Finnish Relief Fund. The game raises more than $20,000 and is won by the National League 2-1 on a walk-off single by Pete Koskar-Art off Bob Feller in the bottom of the ninth. Only 3 days after signing away 11% of its territory, Finland is receiving charity from American baseball players.
We'll close the week with Field Marshal Mannerheim's farewell order to the Finnish army, issued as the guns fall silent. He writes, "After 16 weeks of bloody combat with no rest by day or night, our army stands unconquered before an enemy whose strength has grown in spite of terrible losses. Our fate is hard, but we also know that we've paid to the last penny any debt we may have owed to the West. That an army so inferior in numbers and equipment should have inflicted such serious defeats on an overwhelmingly powerful enemy is a thing for which it is hard to find a parallel in the history of war. But it is equally admirable that the Finnish people were able to resist giving in to despair, and instead to grow in devotion and greatness. Such a nation has earned the right to live." End quote.
So, the guns fired until the literal last minute, and then 450,000 Finns began walking away from everything they owned. Parliament ratified the peace 145-3, and Tanner told the nation their only fault was being too small. Britain's plan to use Finland as a pretext for occupying Norway collapsed the moment the pretext disappeared, and Germany's plan to invade Norway rolled forward regardless. A bomb meant for a naval base killed a man helping his neighbor in a Scottish village. Fritz Todt began building the machine that will run German war production on slave labor. And at a railway station on the Austrian border, two dictators shook hands and agreed that Italy would join this war eventually, on nobody's schedule but their own. Thanks for joining us for episode 27 of History Date Night. We'll see you next time.
See you then.